April 5, 1531, the sky dawned gray over London as if nature itself sensed the horror about to unfold. A crowd gathered at Smithfield, the customary site for executions and cattle fairs. Today, however, something different awaited them in the center of the square. An enormous bronze cauldron rested atop a freshly lit fire. The flames crackled as the water began to heat. A murmur rippled through the crowd when guards brought forth a bound man. His name was Richard Roose, a cook in the service of Bishop John Pfizer. His pale face revealed the terror he felt contemplating the instrument of his death. In moments he would face an execution as rare as it was brutal. He would be boiled alive, feeling every inch of his skin slowly dissolve in boiling water. How did a simple cook end up condemned to such a terrible fate? To understand this macabre story, we must turn back the clock several weeks. February 1531, England was experiencing one of the most turbulent periods in its history. King Henry VIII was determined to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to wed Anne Boleyn. This decision divided the kingdom. On one side stood ambitious courtiers who supported the king's desire, on the other conservative clerics who considered marriage sacred and indissoluble. Among the latter was John Pfizer, Bishop of Rochester, one of the staunchest opponents of the royal divorce. Pfizer, a man of deep religious convictions, had earned the enmity not only of Henry VIII, but also of the Boleyn family, who saw him as an obstacle to their ambitions. The bishop lived in constant apprehension. He slept in different chambers each night and took extraordinary precautions with his food and drink, fearing an attempt on his life. His paranoia, as we shall see, was not unjustified. At the episcopal residence in Lambeth, south of London, Bishop Pfizer maintained a staff of servants, including Richard Roose, his cook. Roose was not particularly remarkable, an ordinary middle-aged man with no distinguishing features that set him apart from the mass of servants who kept the great houses functioning. Discreet and efficient, he had never given reason for suspicion until that fateful February 18th. That afternoon, Pfizer hosted a meal for guests. The menu included a thick soup common in the English diet of the time. Roose prepared the broth as usual, but secretly added a powder to the food later. He would claim he did it as a jest, believing it to be merely a purgative that would cause intestinal discomfort, a cruel prank but not lethal according to his version of events. The bishop, however, ate little of the soup, not from suspicion, but perhaps from lack of appetite. Other guests consumed larger portions at the end of the meal. The leftover food was distributed as was customary to beggars who had come seeking alms. Among them were Bennet Kerwin and Alice Triet, two humble people who could scarcely believe their luck at receiving hot food from a bishop's kitchen. Hours later, the horror began. Excruciating abdominal pains struck all who had consumed the soup, vomiting, cold sweats, convulsions. Pfizer survived, having ingested little of the poison. Others fell gravely ill. Bennet and Alice, however, who had eagerly devoured their portions, were not so fortunate. Their bodies were found the next day contorted in agony. News of the poisoning spread rapidly. Henry VIII himself, upon learning of the incident, was furious. Although Pfizer was his political adversary, an attack of such nature threatened the very institution of monarchy. If bishops could be poisoned, who would guarantee the safety of the king himself? The monarch ordered an immediate investigation. Richard Roose was quickly captured while attempting to flee London. Taken to the Tower of London, he was subjected to the rack, a method of torture in which the prisoner was tied to an X-shaped structure, his limbs stretched almost to breaking point under excruciating pain. Roose confessed to adding the powder to the soup, but insisted he was unaware of its lethal power, believing it to be merely a purgative intended to cause temporary discomfort. Surprisingly, the case did not follow normal legal procedures. On February 28th, Henry VIII personally appeared before Parliament to report the crime, something extraordinary for the era. The king described the poisoning as an act of high treason, not just against Bishop Pfizer, but against the crown itself. Parliament, always eager to please the temperamental monarch, quickly approved the act for poisoning. 22 Henry VIII, Chapter 9. which classified poisoning as high treason and established a specific punishment for such a crime, death by boiling. This fact deserves special attention. Henry VIII not only determined Roose's guilt without a proper trial, but also retroactively created a law to punish him in exemplary fashion. The penalty for treason was already terrible. The condemned was dragged by horses, hanged until nearly dead, castrated and quartered alive, but the king wanted something more, something that would equate to the horror of poisoning, a slow death in which the criminal would experience progressive heat, feeling his body cook slowly. Why such cruelty? Why the king's personal involvement in a case that, although serious, involved only a cook and a bishop, who wasn't even his ally? The motives were never fully clarified. Some historians suggest that Henry VIII had a genuine phobia of poisoning, considering it the most cowardly of deaths, unworthy even for his enemies. Others, more skeptical, see more complex political motivations. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chaput, a confidant of VIII and staunch defender of Queen Catherine, suggested in correspondence that the king acted with such vehemence to divert suspicions from himself, as he is too noble to resort to such means, or at least from the Lady Anne Boleyn and her father. This theory is not without foundation. Rumors circulated quickly after the poisoning, accusing the Boleyn family of having hired Roose to eliminate VIII, one of the greatest obstacles to Henry's marriage plans. The cook's swift and spectacular execution could serve to end any deeper investigation that might potentially implicate figures close to the king. Whatever the truth, Richard Roose's fate was sealed. His execution was set for April 5th. Such an unusual event drew crowds to Smithfield. People pushed to get a good viewing angle. Street vendors circulated offering food and drink as if this were a theatrical spectacle and not the atrocious end of a human being. The great bronze cauldron was already bubbling when Roose was brought forth. Some accounts suggest he was partially sedated with alcohol, a final act of mercy for one who would receive no other. The guards stripped him and lifted him above the cauldron. A prayer was quickly recited by a priest offering absolution for his sins, but no relief for his body. What followed was one of the most horrifying executions recorded in English history. 3 times Roose was immersed in the boiling water. On the first dip, only his legs were submerged. His screams echoed across the square as the skin of his lower limbs separated from the flesh. Some people in the crowd fainted, others turned away, unable to bear the sight. On the second dip, his torso was submerged to the chest. The water, previously clear, acquired a pinkish hue as it dissolved his flesh. His screams were no longer human. They became indistinct gurgles as he struggled for air. On the third and final dip, Richard Roose was completely immersed in the boiling water. Death, though horrible, finally freed him from his torment. 0. Richard Roose's execution did not mark the end of the brutal punishment for those convicted of poisoning. Thanks to the pious new law established by Henry VIII, others would soon face the same fate. In 1542, a woman named Margaret Davies was boiled alive at Smithfield for allegedly poisoning 3 households where she worked. This method of execution remained in place until the reign of Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, when reforms began to limit the most barbaric forms of punishment. But Richard Roose's case remains one of the most disturbing in history. It wasn't just the cruelty of the execution that makes it stand out, but the political context in which it occurred. Roose was a victim of the volatile political and religious atmosphere of the time. England was in the middle of a deep crisis. The king had broken from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England. All of this was tied to his desire to marry Anne Boleyn and secure his dynasty. The poisoning incident became a convenient scapegoat in the greater political game, with VIII being one of the strongest opponents to the king's desires. The Boleyn family and their supporters were quick to accuse him of attempting to eliminate their obstacle in the most cowardly of ways. A direct attack on the crown and monarchy itself, as Henry VIII had suggested, but the true nature of the conspiracy remains unclear. Historians debate whether Richard Roose was truly guilty of poisoning the bishop or whether he was simply a pawn in a much larger political game, what is certain is that his fate was sealed by the whims of the king. And the shifting tides of power and ambition, the execution was not just about the death of a cook, but a statement of power. It was a reminder to all that the king's law was supreme and that no one, even a humble servant, was above the consequences of defying it. Henry VIII's paranoia and brutal methods of justice left a deep scar on English history. Even after his death, his reign continued to shape the nation's future, with fear and suspicion growing as he married more wives and continued his religious reformations. The tragedy of Richard Roose serves as a chilling reminder of how easily those in power can manipulate the system for their own purposes. It reflects a time when the value of human life was determined by political utility and the whims of those in control today. Smithfield is a busy commercial center, and there are no signs or markers to remind passers-by of the horrific events that once took place there. The place where a man was boiled alive has become just another part of the city's bustling landscape, yet the story of Richard Roose continues to resonate. It serves as a dark reminder of the thin line between civilization and barbarism. It is a haunting glimpse into a time when cruelty and justice went hand in hand, when the powerful could rewrite laws and change the fate of the common man with a single decree. 5 centuries have passed since that fateful April day, but the echoes of Roose's scream still linger in the shadows of history.